The adage, "a picture is worth 1,000 words," dates back to the early 1900s, when a newspaper editor by the name of Arthur Brisbane apparently coined the phrase at a meeting of the Syracuse Advertising Men's Club. These days, though, it's the other way round. On social media, everything is worth 1,000 pictures. The Grand Canyon, the Eiffel Tower, your garden shed, your dog, what you had for breakfast, they're all worth sharing, apparently. And the question is, with so many people sharing so many photographs, is there a way you can make yours stand out from the crowd? About a year ago, I wanted to add some special effects to a film I was making, and a friend had introduced me to a company called Boris FX, which makes special effects software used in Hollywood. It turns out that the company also makes software to enhance photographs called Optics. And here it is. Now, I should give some context here. I'm not a professional photographer. In fact, being a professional is not something anyone has ever accused me of. I'm just an enthusiastic hobbyist, but I'm also the publishing editor of a couple of veterinary news websites where I get to report on all sorts of very exciting world events, such as the launch of new flea treatments for cats and dogs. And in that capacity, I've increasingly had to think about how I can make the photos that accompany my news really stand out. Later in this review, though, we'll be joined by a proper professional photographer called Caroline True, who was for many years George Michael's photographer and took some of the most iconic photos of the singer, many of which were enhanced with Boris FX Optics. She'll be sharing some tips for making your photos stand out and how she uses optics for best effect. So what is Boris FX Optics? Well, it's essentially a huge library of filters and special effects which you can apply to your photographs alone or in combination. It also has really easy-to-use masking tools, so you can apply effects just to parts of an image. Now, the effects are grouped into 10 different categories. Here they are running across the bottom of the screen. And each effect has a library of preset variations. It's a huge library, so you may be glad to hear that I'm not going to go through them all right now. But to give you a taste, here are the effects I added to a photograph taken earlier this year of Count Dracula, joining me for a bite to eat. Now, this was nothing more than a holiday snap taken at Universal Studios on an iPhone. So starting on the left-hand side under the Colour tab, you've mainly got tools for adjusting, unsurprisingly, colours, but also saturation, exposure and all that kind of thing. Now, this shot was taken under a yellow awning, so you can see it's got quite a strong yellow cast to it. So I used the Kelvin filter just to remove some of the yellow. Then I created a mask and lowered the exposure on the background to make Dracula stand out a little bit better. Next, I took some of the colour out of his face. There we go, just to make him look a little bit more, well, dead. Then I used another filter to make the whites of his eyes stand out. Make them look a little bit more demonic. There we go. Then we've got the diffusion and blur filters, where again the clue is in the name. I added a touch of blur to the background, again to make the subject stand out that little bit more. Next, we've got the Film Lab tab, which contains effects which reproduce the look of a huge number of different types of film. I added a filter called S-Film Effect to make, to add a little bit of drama. There we go, that really pops now. Then we've got the Gradients and Tints tab, which is for adding colour or exposure gradients and tints. I didn't use any of those on this shot. Next, we've got the Image tab, which contains filters for improving your image and removing artifacts. Again, I didn't use any of those here. Then you've got distortions, which I haven't used very much, except to add a little bit of vignette, which I do a lot of. There we go. That is just adding a little bit of darkness around the edges to lead the eye to the subject. Then finally, one of my favourites, the Light tab. Now, you can do all sorts of clever things here, like adding lens flares and casting light shapes. But for this shot, I just added a touch of ambient light to make Dracula stand out a little bit more. There we go. And then I gave them a teeth polish. And then finally, just a smidgen more light to make both of us stand out a little bit more. And there we have it. The before and after. So in a few relatively short steps, Optics has taken a holiday snap and turned it into something which I think really stands out. And I haven't even talked about the filters and the render and particle effects tabs with which you could create all sorts of things like smoke and clouds and lightning out of absolutely nothing. Now, many of the effects you see in Optics can be done in programs like Photoshop and Lightroom. But the thing I find about Photoshop is that you've really got to understand how it works in order to know what it can do. Optics, on the other hand, requires very little understanding of how it works. You just have this huge bank of effects to play around with and draw inspiration from. I also found the workflow so much quicker using Optics. I just work from left to right through the tabs, playing around to see which effect makes the difference. But as I say, I'm an amateur. So let's see what a professional can do with Boris FX Optics. And here, thankfully, is a professional I prepared earlier. Caroline, welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you for being my very first guest.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, a few weeks ago, Caroline and I thought we'd take some portraits to show off what Optics can do. The problem was we couldn't think of any global megastar singers who live in the village. So instead, we went to go and photograph the next most famous celebrities in the village, namely the postmaster and the publican. And to make it a little bit more interesting, Caroline shot her photographs using her professional gear. Caroline, remind me, what was that?
It was a Nikon D850 and an 85mm portrait lens.
And a light?
Pro-photo lighting.
Fantastic. Meanwhile, I used my trusty iPhone 15 Pro Max. So let's see what we managed to produce. This first shot of our postmaster is Caroline's, and this one is as it came out of the camera. I think it's a really lovely shot. But now here it is again after Boris FX Optics. And that's really enhanced the colours. So what did you do, Caroline?
Well, I cropped it to enhance the composition. And to enhance the colours, I just gave it a couple of filters in Boris. Kodachrome was one of them, which gives it a lovely depth and a bit of contrast. And I added some warmth in colour correct.
Then it was my turn, and here's my unedited shot as it came out of the iPhone 15 Pro Max. And here it is after Boris Optics. Now, obviously, I've cropped it, but I've also added some background light to draw the eye to his face and a bit of vignette. Then Caroline and I headed off down to the pub to take some more portraits. And here are Caroline's shots as they came out of the camera. And here they are again after Boris FX. And look at this one. Gosh, that's an amazing shot. Caroline, what did you do with it?
Well, much the same as I did with the postmaster, cropped, which is my workflow. Took some of the highlights out of the bottles. I gave it a filter, a Kodachrome filter, which is actually one of my favourite of all the Boris film filters. I did a little bit of work on her skin, also in Boris, and gave her a little bit of steam coming out of the milk jug.
You call that steam? I'll give you steam. Watch this, just coming up in a moment. Here's my first shot as it came out of the camera. I must say, the iPhone was struggling a little bit in the low light, and I didn't think there was an awful lot I could do with the shot, but I did decrease the brightness on the monitor behind his head, which was a little bit distracted, added a little bit of extra background blur and some vignette. But in my second shot here, I darkened and desaturated the background a bit, and ta-da! Some real moving steam. Okay, so it's not actually real steam. This is a cinematograph, essentially a photograph with typically one moving element within it. And in this case, I used the Optics particle emitter to generate the moving steam. Caroline, there was another shot you took recently and edited with Boris Optics. Tell me a little bit about this one.
That's my friend Clare, who makes the best gardening gloves. They're called donkey gloves, and she has a website, donkeygloves.co.uk.
Shameless plug.
Shameless plug, indeed. And it sort of felt a little out of camera, this shot felt a little sort of Caravaggio kind of light to me, and it sort of lended itself to being black and white. So I used one of the Boris black and white filters, gave a little vignette. I pulled out the highlights in her face and her hand, and with the easy mask, which is indeed very easy in Boris, I brought back the colour of the gloves a little bit, about 80%, I think.
Caroline, there's another shot you took which Boris FX played a pretty important part in, isn't there?
There is indeed. And I actually have a hard copy of it here. This is a photo that I took of my friend George Michael in Sydney in 2011. I think it was 2011. It was when we were filming the True Faith video. Mm-hmm. And George and I sat and worked on the edit together. So what I did was we cropped it into that amazing crop, which I just love. That was mostly him, not me. Mm-hmm. And then I put a filter on it for the skin filter, for which I used Portraiture, which is by Imagenomic, which is very obvious on that shot, and we just kind of liked it. And then I used the cross-processing filter in Boris, and that was it. It was basically 3 clicks. It was crop, skin, cross-processing, and that sort of plays into my less is more.
Caroline, that's such an iconic shot. I wonder if you've got 3 tips that could help other people who want to make their photographs stand out.
Well, I sure have. One of them I would say is be inspired. Find photos that you love and learn by them. Look at the images and see if you can copy what they look like. My inspirations were David Bailey. I know it sounds a bit obvious, but he was a genius portrait photographer. Jean-Baptiste Mondino, Irving Penn, for them, both their portraits, and Irving Penn for sure for his flowers. Right. The next tip which is the most important thing for me, and it's my ethos, is keep it simple. Less is more. And even less is even more.
Indeed. And in fact, there's another photograph of yours here which illustrates that ethos better than almost any others I've seen. It's an absolutely stunning shot. It's really beautiful, pretty much as it came out of the camera.
As much as it came out of the camera. 2 dahlias from my garden and a beautiful vase. And into Boris for a little bit of colour correction, just to bring out a little bit of contrast, and tiny bit of texture in the flowers. But that's it. Yeah. And that's how I like to use Boris. Other people use it differently, but
yes, I'm somewhat more aggressive than I am.
Exactly, but that's what I'm saying. You have to learn from, you have to learn from what makes you happy.
So, Caroline, what's your 3rd tip?
My 3rd tip is to be ruthless in your editing. Just pick the shots you love, or if you're taking pictures of a client, the shots that your client loves. After all, there's only ever one album cover or Vogue cover, so that's what I'm always looking for, is the shot. And most of the rest of them I never look at again. And the other part of my 3rd tip, which is maybe a 4th tip, is workflow. It's really, really important that you have a good workflow in your photo editing. Yeah. And which obviously includes Boris, but every other step of the way. And without going into boring stuff here, we've put a link below into a free book which is written by a lovely friend of mine called George, funnily enough, different George, which takes you through the digital imaging workflow, best practice, and it's free.
Now, I said earlier that as the editor of a veterinary news service, I get lots of really pretty dull photographs sent by PR people to accompany their press releases. Here's one. It doesn't exactly leap off the page, does it? And as far as editing goes, I think that's probably the dictionary definition of polishing a turd. But in just a few clicks with Optics and ta-da! There we go. That's a bit more like it. A small explosion and some colour, and that'll stand out much more on Instagram. So there we have it. If I'm honest, I was a bit sceptical about Optics when I first started using it. I just saw this huge library of effects and couldn't really imagine when I'd ever use them. But as I started playing around with it, I found that the variety of filters and the way they're presented is a huge source of inspiration, which is such an important part of the creative process. And unlike the filters in other editing programs, these are almost infinitely customizable. Now, I guess if you're a professional portrait photographer like Caroline, getting such good images straight out of the camera, you may only need to use Boris FX Optics sparingly to get the effect you're after. But if you're involved in marketing, or if you're an amateur like me, you can use optics much more aggressively to turn unremarkable images into something much more eye-catching. If you know anyone who enjoys photography or who wants to create images that'll stand out in a crowded social media marketplace, you might like to share this review. Otherwise, till the next time, I've been Arlo Guthrie. Bye-bye.